Thanks so much for joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm joining you here with some breaking news that we have been anticipating for really the entire week now. The special purpose grand jury report on whether there was any kind of misconduct or illegal activity surrounding the 2020 presidential election here in the state of Georgia by the former president and many others. That report has just been released, and here's part of it in my hand right now. I should introduce myself as well. My name is Joy Lim Nacker, and I'm a new anchor reporter with Atlanta News First, Atlanta News First Plus, and I am a licensed attorney, so hopefully that can help you dissect this a little bit. But I want to take a moment to read this. In the meantime, I want to bring in our investigative reporter, Andy Parati, who has a very important guest with us, who is actually a witness during this grand jury probe. Andy.
Now, from Atlanta News First, the special grand jury report.
Joining us now is former State Senator Jen Jordan, who is also the former nominee for Attorney General for the Democratic Party. But most importantly for this conversation is that you testified in front of the special grand jury. Before we get into that and you taking us behind the scenes of what that was like, I want to get your initial reaction to this 9-page release. In my opinion, very underwhelming amount of detail. What stuck out to you so far?
Look, I think the most significant thing is the fact that the grand jury believed that people were lying under oath to them. And they've basically empowered the district attorney to go even further and bring indictments with respect to perjury if that's necessary.
Right.
So it's one of those things where it's almost, some folks may have made the situation even worse for themselves by what they said to the grand jury under oath.
Right, and here's a quote from one of those reports, one of the 9 pages in that report. We find a unanimous vote that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning the election. Another thing that is not included in the report, I have a lot of questions based on what has been released. They recommend indictments.
That's right.
They say a number of witnesses potentially committed perjury. They don't tell you how many people they recommend for indictment, nor do they say how many people they believe committed perjury. What's your take on that?
Look, I think they heard evidence from over 75 witnesses. So this is a group of people, of citizens, who took this incredibly seriously. And when we talk about when they heard evidence or whenever they, did business as the grand jury, 16 to 24 people, regular people, right? Not lawyers, not election law experts.
And they say that in this
report.
report.
They say we are normal people, and what we've been done is we've been brought in to hear the evidence and hear what people have to say, and here's our report. And I have to tell you, it's incredibly compelling that you do have ordinary people saying there's a real problem here, but it had nothing to do with the election. It really was about people trying to overturn it.
Another thing that caught my eye and that I'd love your perspective on is it says in this report it fails to include any. If this report fails to include any potential violations or reference statutes that were not shown in this investigation, we acknowledge the discretion of the district attorney to seek indictments where she finds sufficient cause. How do you interpret what they're saying? It sounds like they're saying, in case we recommend indictments for charges that you don't think are appropriate, you find the appropriate charge. Is that what they're kind of saying here?
Yeah, because really they were listening to evidence, right? A jury or normal people don't know, well, OCGA 251 is where we need to go with this. But they do know that if certain elements have been met, and if they think, like I said, ultimately if people were lying, or if what they said really did kind of fall under one of the laws or one of the criminal statutes that they were presented. Look, they're just saying we're ordinary people. We know what we heard. We know what we saw. But to the extent that the district attorney needs to come in here and be very specific in terms of the statutes we're talking about, then absolutely she's empowered to do that.
Again, overwhelming lack of detail of exactly what they were provided. We were talking earlier. We were trying to surmise of what was going to be released. You thought maybe it was going to be the entire report, but just a lot of redactions. And instead, they simply just uploaded to the clerk of court's office 9 pages with very little information, pretty much almost summarizing what we were already told we were going to get, but with no detail.
Right. It's like the screenshots of the areas of the report. Look, I think this is incredibly important. But what I do think this tells us, because we really didn't learn much from what was released is that what is to come is going to be very specific. It's going to name names, and it's going to point fingers. And I think it's going to be compelling, but I think that it's going to be a bombshell when it comes out.
If anything, this confirms finally that the special grand jury has recommended criminal indictments for individuals that they believe were responsible for meddling in Georgia's 2020 election. We now know that, and we were speculating that. We were reading into what the judge's order, Judge McBurney's order, was saying, but now we have it confirmed. And then in addition to that, we also confirmed that they believe perjury was potentially committed with the witnesses too.
Yeah, well, and look, there would be nothing to redact if there weren't recommendations for criminal indictments. At the end of the day, if the grand jury would have come back and said nothing to see here with respect to people trying to overturn the election, and everybody was truthful when they came in and gave testimony, then, you know, the report would be released and we'd all go along our way. The fact that we're dealing with a redacted report right now, and specifically the guidance in terms of perjury, I think Madam DA has a lot of work ahead of her, but you know, I think people need to be calling their lawyers right now.
Speaking of people who may be worried, former President Donald Trump, talk to me about why these potential state charges are so problematic for Mr. Trump, former President Trump. I was looking into, you know, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, if he is found guilty on a state charge, there's no mechanism for him or any of his allies to essentially wipe these charges away or dismiss these charges as he's done for some of his allies before he left office. Is that right?
That's right. There is no pardon power from the president.
Pardon. That's what I was looking for.
At the presidential level, at the federal level for state law claims. And that's why this investigation was so incredibly important, because you could have a president come in and pardon people or say, you know what, we're going to move on. But this deals specifically with Georgia laws that were broken, and with attempts to overturn the election in this state. And you know what? The special grand jury has done their job, and now I think it's time for the district attorney's office to do theirs.
Let's talk a little bit about your participation in this special grand jury. You were a witness. You were called last year, along with 15 other public officials, 75 total witnesses. Take us behind the scenes. Talk to us about the process. How were you notified? And take us in that room with these special grand jurors asking, because they asked you questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it depended on the grand juror, too. I mean, there were young grand jurors in there that were asking questions about social media, because specifically you had some of the targets of the investigation that had gone on social media and said and done certain things, right? But then there were other people who were really concerned about kind of the nuts and bolts of what happened that day. But really, it bounced around. It was very interesting because it was a free-flowing conversation, I should say, and they were allowed to ask any question, you know, that they wanted to ask.
I think that's so fascinating. I think a lot of people may not know that these grand jurors were asking questions. I think the assumption that I have, or maybe other people have, is they just sit idly listening to a presentation. But it sounds like, based on your experience, they were participating. They wanted to get answers to specific questions.
Yeah, I think they took the charter that formed them very seriously. Look, this was a very serious case, very serious evidence, and serious people coming in. They heard testimony from the governor of the state of Georgia. That's a big deal. If you can imagine that you're a grand juror and you're sitting there and you are questioning some of the most powerful people in the state. But that's just it. That's what our system is set up for, that even the powerful actually do have to answer to the people ultimately.
And all of these special grand jurors, 16 to 24 of them, I forgot how many people they met during this process. Some, the highest forms of government in our state and in the federal government. And they're asking these people questions.
Senator Lindsey Graham,
right?
You know, you have these people who are considered the most powerful people in the country and in the world to some respect, and they had to come in and they had to answer to the people of the state of Georgia. And that, I think what we've seen from the report, the little bit we've seen, is that the grand jurors took that very, very seriously.
Jen, thank you so much. We've been speaking with former Senator Jen Jordan, who testified as part of the special grand jury. Joy, we're going to send it back to you for more perspective.
All right, thank you so much, Andy. Of course, we have a team of experts standing by to kind of break down what this report means. But as expected, it's very limited, the information that we're getting, because again, Fulton County Superior Court Judge McBurney already restricted it to just the introduction, the conclusion, and Section 8, which basically is where these grand jurors, these special grand jurors, talk about their concerns about witnesses lying under oath to them. But I want to show you this part of this report, the special purpose grand jury report just released moments ago. So I thought this was interesting. You can see it says, the grand jury heard extensive testimony on the subject of alleged election fraud from poll workers, investigators, technical experts, and state of Georgia employees and officials, as well as from persons still claiming that fraud took place. We find, here's what's important, we find by unanimous vote that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning that election. So, of course, language matters, right? I mean, I want to break down a bit that language and what that means. So, at this point, I'd like to bring in our guest analyst. We have attorney Holly Waltman joining us live here in studio at Atlanta News First for Atlanta News First Plus. Holly, again, I just want to reiterate this line for the viewers. We find that no widespread fraud took place in the election that's being investigated, Georgia 2020 presidential election, that could result in overturning that election. That doesn't mean there was no fraud whatsoever. Is that right?
That's correct, Joy. I read it the same way you do. And while we don't have the meats and potatoes of this report in its entirety, we did get a little bit of a preview from Judge McBurney's 8-page order released earlier, and it kind of foreshadowed a little bit of what we were going to see here. Regardless if there was widespread fraud, no fraud, or a tiny bit of fraud, what we have from this special grand jury is perjury allegations, right? They did not believe a good number of the people that came in. And had that been you, me, or someone that is not as high up in politics as these individuals, we would already be arrested and charged with felony perjury.
Yeah, I want to ask you about some of the potential charges that could come out of this. And I just want to, again, just for context, reiterate for our viewers that this is a special purpose grand jury. They're not a regular grand jury. They don't have the power to actually issue any indictments here. Their job was to do an investigation, which they spent some 8 months doing, and then come up with recommendations and for the district attorney, for Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, and it's up to her how to proceed from there, if she wants to indict anyone and so forth. But when we're talking about indictments, you talked about perjury. What other charges do you think we could potentially see out of this?
Well, there's several options, and there's lots of alleged crimes that could come of this that Ms. Willis and her office could choose to move forward on. The special grand jury, like you mentioned, is unlike, I guess, a normal grand jury or a typical grand jury that hears probable cause on multiple different alleged crimes that Ms. Willis and her office might believe have happened inside Fulton County. The special grand jury will make the recommendation to her office. I know that she will spend the resources and the taxpayer money looking into this. I don't believe that she's done this exercise and asked for these special groups of people to convene for many, many months to do nothing about it. So we will get more. I know that she has at least dripped us a little bit about the timeline. We shall get that information when we receive it.
Excuse me for the coughing. Yeah, I mean, so you make an excellent point. She's a prosecutor, and that's her job, is to prosecute. If there are any grounds for indictment, that's what she's supposed to do, right? Is issue indictments, and she didn't impanel this jury to work for 8 months for nothing. That said, it's very interesting that she said during the January 24th hearing about whether this whole report should be released, she was concerned about the rights of the defendants here. She didn't want the report to be released. She said, we needed to protect the due process rights. So I want to ask you why that is. Is it because she wanted to make sure that if she achieves convictions, there are no grounds for appeal, that these convictions stick?
Certainly, and right now we're in the beginning process of this, right? We are looking for probable cause, which is a legal standard. It's one of the lowest ones available, and it basically is just, if somebody's testimony is believed, then there is probable cause to move forward. Does that equate into proof beyond reasonable doubt at the end of a trial or at the end of one of these proceedings? Absolutely not. It is a very steep hill to climb. She does have her work cut out for her. There will be, if and when we do see indictments and people get arrested and charged, there will be a slew of defense attorney teams ready to put under a microscope everything her office has done to this point.
Yeah, undoubtedly so. In terms of what happens next, of course, like we said, this special purpose grand jury made recommendations. It's the district attorney, Fani Willis's job to actually go forth with indictments. She has been very tight-lipped on whether, there are going to be indictments, who would be charged here. But she has said, quote, decisions are imminent. And she also clarified in a legal sense, not reporter sense, because, TV news, we work pretty fast. And as you know, the legal process can be slow, and that's because we want it to be thorough. But realistically, how soon after, how soon after this report's released, how soon from now can we expect indictments?
How soon can we expect indictments, or when will we realistically see them? I know she has spoken about the midterm elections, and one of the things that's mysterious about a general grand jury or a typical grand jury is that they can be convening right now. We don't know. That is not necessarily public knowledge that gets to be brought out. And so I think that that's why we have the limited information that we have released from Judge McBurney today. We don't have the names of the individuals that could be being presented right now in front of a grand jury for Fulton County.
Yeah, and of course, one of the reasons this is so important is not just because we want to protect the democratic process and we don't, we want to guard against illegal activity and hold people accountable when they do break the law. But beyond that, there are political ramifications, not just nationwide on the national scale, but really hyper-local politics could be impacted by this. So at this point, I would like to bring in my colleague, political reporter Doug Reardon, who is outside the Fulton County Superior Courthouse. So Doug, obviously this report, much anticipated, now coming down. What's your reaction? Okay, I think we maybe have a little connection issue with Doug. May not be hearing us.
Josh, you calling? No, it was Maria.
Okay, yeah. I think we'll have to check back in with Doug a little bit later. But Holly, we talked about the kind of due process rights that were being protected here in this decision not to release the full report. And I want to take this opportunity to provide a little bit of context actually for the viewers, because we also don't want to, just like the Judge McBurney, who issued the order, you don't want to convict people in the court of public opinion. You don't want to get ahead of yourself. This special purpose grand jury, they're just investigating. They're just investigating, right? So what does that look like?
So largely what they did and what they were charged with doing is getting together for what we know is months and months, witness after witness. They were charged with inquiring about the evidence that was presented by Ms. Willis's office to them. They also were able to inquire about additional evidence that they would have found helpful in making their determination and their recommendation to her office.
Yeah, and this obviously it's a local group who was impaneled to look into all this, and it's a huge responsibility because of course this has ramifications nationwide, not just here in Georgia. I would say probably especially here in Georgia. But it has been mentioned that I guess by some that perhaps the due process rights. I don't want to speculate, but because these individuals, when talking to the grand jury, they didn't have their attorneys present. But that's something that's and not all of them had their attorneys present. Some of them were allowed to kind of touch base with their attorneys, to take breaks, and so forth. But it's not like going to court and your defense counsel is right next to you if you're someone who's being investigated or serving as a witness. How does that whole process work?
Right, so there's probably different types of witnesses that we could categorize. There were people that were there to give their firsthand accounts of what had happened to them, and they may not specifically have been a target or a person of interest in this investigation, but rather just an eyewitness, right? Someone with firsthand accounts. The people that I know that there were several individuals that were subpoenaed to appear because they had previously told Ms. Willis's office and the district attorney's office that they were not going to voluntarily come in and speak with them upon their request. So I think a large part of this was to get those individuals who they hadn't already spoken with, who may probably, we will find, end up being suspects or persons of interest in this.
Yeah, so we actually prepared a kind of a list of, just for our viewers to see, of some of the officials who have testified, very high-profile officials. Digital producer Maria Murrow is around here somewhere, but when she gets a chance, I'd love for her to pull up that list so we could take a look at it. But just kind of to give our viewers a little bit of context, there were 17 people who were notified that they were targets, might be considered targets of the investigation, very high-profile individuals, including Rudy Giuliani, including the Georgia GOP chair, David Schaefer. And again, in terms of who testified, very high-profile individuals, including U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, including Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. I see Maria's over here. Brian, if you're able to pull up that full screen that we prepared, it just kind of showing the list of the individuals who have testified. It's really incredible. And of course, one of the more notable ones among them, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, because of course there was that phone call that leaked and got a lot of airplay and a lot of attention for sure. But you can see these individuals up on your screen who did testify. Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, former Georgia Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, Cobb County Elections Director Janine Evler, former White House National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, former U.S. House Speaker Newt Gingrich, as I mentioned, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, former DeKalb County Elections Director Erica Hamilton, U.S. House Rep for Georgia Jody Hice, Georgia Senator Jen Jordan, who joined us here live in studio with an interview here for Atlanta News First, and I mentioned Governor Brian Kemp, former Georgia Senator William Lennon, Mark Meadows, the former White House Chief of Staff, Bee Nguyen, former Georgia House Rep, Elena Parent, the Georgia Senator, Brad Raffensperger, I mentioned, Georgia Secretary of State, David Ralston, former Georgia House Rep as well. Holly, I just want to pick your brain a little bit because we're looking at a very high-profile lineup of people who are involved in this investigation. Now, look, again, just to be clear, these weren't necessarily targets of the investigation. These were witnesses. So, again, we want to make sure that in our media coverage we are respectful of that, sort of like with due process, right, under the law. But how does that change a special purpose grand jury probe? Does it change it?
Well, it certainly changes it because, of course, there's media coverage surrounding it. And this is, in my opinion, a really unique screen that we just had up and covered because we get to see a preview of what potentially would be a state's witness list in the prosecution of these alleged crimes, right? A mixture of people that might find themselves on the other side of the V, on the defendant side, and people that are going to find themselves as state witnesses that are going to have to come and tell a jury of the Fulton County taxpayers exactly what happened and what they believe crimes occurred.
Yeah, and I know that we have that phone call that is really, can I say it went viral? I mean, it's gone viral. Everyone, I think, has heard this phone call between the former president and Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State at the time. And, many have argued that this phone call is some sort of evidence of illegal activity. If we can just let's play that phone call for our viewers.
There's nothing wrong with saying that that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes. You should want to have an accurate election. And you're a Republican.
We believe that we do have an accurate election.
No, no, you don't. No, you don't. You don't have, not even close. Nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
Now, do you think it's possible that they shredded ballots in Fulton County? Because that's what the rumor is. And also that Dominion took out machines. That Dominion is really moving fast to get rid of their... under law, you're not allowed to give faulty election results, okay? You're not allowed to do that, and that's what you've done. This is a faulty election result.
Mr. President, you have people that submit information, and we have our people that submit information, and then it comes before the court, and the court then has to make a determination. We have to stand by our numbers. We believe our numbers are right.
All right, so you were just listening to that January of 2021 phone call between then former President Donald Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. And just remember the timeline here. That's just a short time after the election in November. Sorry, I'm kind of multitasking here, so pardon me if I seem a little distracted. But I want to bring in now someone who knows this timeline very well, someone who has been following this case very closely, and someone who also has been looking into, through his sources, the impact on politics, not just nationwide, but especially right here in Georgia. Political reporter Doug Reardon joining us live now from outside the Fulton County Superior Courthouse. Doug, what's your reaction to this report now just released?
Yeah, good morning to you, Joy. I don't think it was the explosive document that people maybe anticipated it would be, but we certainly did learn some things from it. It was an 8-page report. It was uploaded to the Fulton County Superior Court's website just this morning. A couple things that we learned from it. It explicitly says that there was no widespread voter fraud that took place during Georgia's vote casting in November of 2020. The panel was unanimous on that. 26 members voted to say that there was no fraud during the election that year. They heard in this from poll workers, investigators, technical experts, Georgia officials, and employees. No surprise there. What they heard, that is what was left out of this report and what we will have to find out later. Something else that was interesting about this, on page 8, it says a majority of the grand jury believes that perjury may have been committed by one or more witnesses testifying before it. Now, of course, that was also something that we had anticipated would be in this report. But again, what's missing is who they believe or who they know might have actually committed that crime or potential crime. The grand jury also voted to recommend that this report be released. And if you recall, District Attorney Fani Willis did not want the report released at all. In fact, a contingency of media outlets, including Atlanta News First, actually had to take legal steps to get to this point today. It was just a matter of protecting the due process of some of these people that were subpoenaed by this grand jury and appeared before them to offer their testimony. And so here's where we are today. It was definitely... Okay. It was definitely, certainly a fight to get where we were today. But now as for what comes next, there is a meeting, and I know that one of your experts in the studio, Joy, mentioned this on March 1st. That will be the next meeting of the regular grand jury. The steps that have to be taken in this will require this to go through a regular grand jury. Keep in mind, this was a special grand jury that was impaneled a couple of months back. But as we said, the thing that I think most people were really wanting to see was who might be recommended to be charged in this process. What will happen after this, again, once this goes back to the grand jury, is they'll take a look at all the evidence. Again, it's been packaged really nicely in a box for them in this special grand jury report, and they'll make their recommendations to District Attorney Willis at some point. She used the word imminent. We have no idea what that means as far as a timeline on this. As for how this could affect Georgia politics, certainly there are several really high-profile high-profile names that appear on the list of, one, witnesses who were subpoenaed, and two, that slate of fake electors that days after this all happened, the election took place and played out and was called for Joe Biden, put their names on a document, sent it to the National Archives, and tried to at least put Georgia's 16 electoral votes to President Donald Trump. It did not work, of course. Georgia was called and remained called for President Joe Biden. But some of the names on that list include current Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, as well as the state GOP chair, David Schaefer, who recently announced he would not be running for re-election for that position. So as for how this could affect state politics, we'll just have to wait and see if either of those two names, as well as the slew of many other officials in the GOP in state office, are also indicted at any point. That certainly would have implications, especially in the state party. As for how it could affect national politics, I think the biggest thing that we need to look at is who could enter the race. How could this affect former President Donald Trump's future run for the White House, which has already kicked off? You know, we were talking to experts all week who were telling us this could really embolden other candidates who might be mulling a run to come out and do just that, because again, this could really hobble the president's ability to message to voters, his ability to, it could take up a pretty good amount of his time trying to fight this, of course. One other thing to note that we did note earlier too is that of all the witnesses that testified before this special grand jury, President Donald Trump was not one of them. He did not come before this grand jury to offer his testimony. Just about everybody else did. There were not too many issues with that. And so, again, this is the report itself was very short, very concise. There weren't even any redactions. We just didn't get the pages at all that were left out of this report. And so, again, as for a timeline on indictments, as for a timeline on how fast this regular grand jury could work, we don't know. Those are things that we're just going to have to keep an eye on, and we certainly will. Keep in mind, we'll be streaming all afternoon here on Atlanta News First Plus on our First Alert desk, Joy, where you are now. And for the time being, we'll send it back to you in the studio.
All right, thank you so much. Political reporter Doug Reardon reporting from the Fulton County Superior Courthouse with us with that live report. So, you know, Doug did point out a very important note here, which is that the former president, Donald Trump himself, did not actually serve as a witness to this special purpose grand jury. And I've actually just been monitoring Twitter. I just want to show you what I've been doing over here. You know, no tweets. The last tweet from the president, as we can see, January 8th of 2021. You know, I monitored any tweets for the governor, Brian Kemp, also questioned as part of this investigation. And of course, looking for any tweets, nothing yet from the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, you know, questioned as well. And we heard that phone call between him and former President Trump a little bit earlier. And looking for anything from Senator Lindsey Graham, not seeing any tweets from him as well. Also questioned, another high-profile official questioned as part of the investigation. But let's look at this report. Again, this report just released a short time ago. Here's part of it, and here's what I think is probably the most important part of it. You know, this is generally a vague what information we have received, but it says this grand jury heard extensive testimony on the subject of alleged election fraud from poll workers, investigators, technical experts, and state of Georgia employees and officials, as well as from persons still claiming that such fraud took place. And here's the important part. We find by unanimous vote that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning that election. It doesn't mean that no fraud took place. It just means no fraud that could result in overturning that election. So it doesn't mean that we're not going to see indictments. And in fact, that's something that, of course, our team here at Atlanta News First Plus and Atlanta News First has inquired about. We, of course, have been in touch with the office of Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. She's been very tight-lipped about whether we can anticipate any indictments. Of course, not going to go into who could potentially be indicted. For all we know, there could be another grand jury, not a special purpose grand jury, another grand jury impaneled right now, tasked with actually issuing an indictment. But the point of this report that we've just gotten part of today was really to provide some information to DA Willis and basically help her make a decision on how to move forward. They were officially tasked with making a recommendation, making recommendations, not issuing indictments, making recommendations. This is what we believe should happen based on this investigation that we've done. Again, they were impaneled last year, and they were at it for some 8 months, right, interviewing dozens of witnesses. But at this point, I want to. Maria, let me stop for a second. Maria, our digital producer, it looks like you called something up. Did you want me to go to that? Okay, we're going to go to that a little bit later. So at this point, just kind of for context, let's go through the timeline a little bit, because there's a lot going on. I know it's confusing, but just looking at how this whole thing is unfolded. Okay, so it all starts Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020. This is the presidential election day. And then fast forward a couple weeks, Thursday, November 9th of 2020, Georgia, the state of Georgia, in the presidential election was called for Joe Biden. Okay, fast forward to January 2nd, 2021. What is that, 6 weeks or so later? Trump then calls Raffensperger. And at that point, asked him to find 11,780 votes. We heard that phone call. We're going to play it for you again in a little bit here. January of 2022, Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis petitions for this special grand jury. This is the report we're now sharing with you. It's from this special grand jury. Monday, May 2nd of 2022 is when this actual special grand jury was sworn in, started their investigation, and then December of 2022, that is when they actually submit this special grand jury actually submits their final report to DA Willis. And then we hear from DA Willis again, just a short time ago, Tuesday, February 7th. She says a decision on the charges is, quote, imminent. And then earlier this week on Valentine's Day, February 14th, Fulton County Judge Robert McBurney ordered the partial release of this special grand jury report. And this is where we are right now. This is the report that we've shared with you in part. All of this work that's been going on ever since this jury was actually impaneled last year. And they've been at it again. It's been 8 months, interviewing dozens and dozens of witnesses. I know we actually have a clip from DA Willis talking about this report. And what's really interesting is she did not want this report to come out. There was a hearing, it was January 24th, not too long ago, and basically this was to decide whether this report should be released. If so, how much of it should be released. There was a media coalition, which did include us here at Atlanta News First, Atlanta News First Plus, the Associated Press, several other major media outlets. We actually sued. The media coalition sued, or our attorney sued. Not me personally. Not I shouldn't say it like that. But this media coalition sued because they wanted the right to have this full report released. They wanted it to be seen in full. The attorney argued this is a First Amendment issue. It's the right to free press. It's an issue of judicial transparency, that the public has a right to know about our court system, the legal system, the judicial process, how it's operating, what is the result of what's been going on here. And then on the other side, completely opposed to releasing the report, was actually the district attorney. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. She didn't want any of it released. She wanted the whole thing kept under wraps. And you think in your head, that sounds a little counterintuitive. She launched this investigation, but what she said in this hearing was she wanted to protect the rights of the defendants, of potential defendants down the line, constitutional rights of due process, and not just put names out there without having that due process in place. So I want to actually play for you a clip of both DA Willis as well as the media coalition attorney, kind of going back and forth, giving their very different stances on this issue. And this is from that hearing, January 24th, that I mentioned, where this judge made this decision about what we actually got to see today.
In this case, the state understands the media's inquiry and the world's interest, but we have to be mindful of protecting future defendants' rights. And so, representing the state of Georgia and these citizens, I know we do have this common interest. We want to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. And we think for future defendants to be treated fairly, it's not appropriate at this time to have this report released.
Obviously, we believe the report should be released now and in its entirety. And now that special purpose grand jury has issued a report, and the jurors themselves have asked for it to be published. There's enormous public interest in what they have said, and that exists in this state, it exists across the nation, it exists beyond the nation.
Yeah, so there you hear, first again, that was Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis explaining that she didn't want this report that we just got, this report that everyone's been waiting for, to be released at all, none of it. And then you got the attorney for the Media Coalition saying we want to see the whole thing. Well, ultimately, where the judge landed is somewhere in the middle and decided, well, you're going to get 3 parts of it. This is what we get to actually look through today. 3 parts of this. We got the introduction, we got the conclusion, and then we got a section called Section 8, which is basically where this special purpose grand jury talks about their concerns that some of the witnesses may have lied under oath to the grand jury during this investigation. So that's what we got to hear about. And this is all really important because not only huge ramifications for the individuals involved who may be targets of the investigation, may potentially be indicted, but how could this affect our political system? What could this change kind of party dynamics? Who runs for president? I want to bring in at this point someone who I would consider an expert, especially in local politics. Tim Darnell is a digital producer here at Atlanta News First Plus and also leads our weekly political update. Tim, just seeing this report come out, knowing what you know about the context, what do you think are the political implications?
Joy, I think the political implications are still yet to be determined. We knew from the fact that Fulton County DA Fani Willis her office did not object to Judge McBurney's decision to partially release some of this report today, that we were not going to get a lot of detail. Mm-hmm. And yet there are still political ramifications, like you were saying a few moments ago. What happens if someone is indicted? If Donald Trump himself is indicted? We don't know. For all we know, the district attorney and her staff in their office right now could be handing out or in the process of issuing indictments now or sometime in the near future, perhaps over the next month or so. That's the big unknown as far as this entire process. From a political standpoint, what happens if Donald Trump is indicted? Does that open the floodgates for a lot of Republican contenders? We've already seen Nikki Haley announce her candidacy. We know that Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, a lot of fairly well-known GOP political heavyweights have written books. Ron DeSantis also testing the political publishing waters, if you will. National political figures, when they're thinking about running for higher office, publishing a book is usually the first thing that they do that gets them on the national limelight. If there is no indictment, does that chill, for lack of a better word, the waters for some of these potential Republican contenders for president next year? Maybe that emboldens Donald Trump a little bit more and his core group of very committed, very ardent supporters. So that's a big unknown throughout this entire process.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Very, very interesting. And, I was just kind of reading some of the comments of several political experts that I know that we got a chance to interview, and I'm seeing that one political science professor at Kennesaw State, Dr. Ben Taylor, said if Trump is named, then he'll have to deal with this every time he makes appearances in the press, talking about the potential ramifications on the upcoming presidential campaign as well. But also I want to ask you about even just being kind of involved in the investigation, just being named as witnesses. We've got several high-profile politicians right here in Georgia, including the governor, who are witnesses in the investigation. Has that already impacted local politics?
I'm not really sure about the impact on Governor Kemp. Let's face it, Governor Kemp is the most popular governor in Georgia of this century, bar none. He just handily defeated Stacey Abrams by a fairly substantial margin. Stacey Abrams, once considered to be the National Democratic Party's next rising star. Brian Kemp won re-election by a larger margin than he won election against Abrams back in 2018. Brian Kemp's future, his political future, political popularity is very strong here in Georgia. The mere fact that he testified, okay, yes, he did. The other issues are, look at some of the other Georgia officials who did testify. Brad Raffensperger, currently our Secretary of State, Chris Carr, currently Attorney General. Both men have been featured prominently as potential gubernatorial candidates in 2028 when Brian Kemp is no longer allowed constitutionally to run for re-election. I'm more interested in some of the other names outside the state who were involved in this. We know that U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina was asked just a few moments ago, and saw one of our emails come across our board, where he was asked, he was at a public appearance somewhere, he was asked about the Fulton County grand jury report. His reply was, I don't know anything about it, I'll let you know when we actually see it. So he may not even be aware of the contents of the entire report as well. So there are some other, Rudy Giuliani, formerly known as America's mayor, and now an attorney for Donald Trump, was called to testify. It was very interesting when all this was going on that Bonnie Willis, the district attorney for Fulton County, was attempting to call a lot of these elected officials to testify during the electoral process, during the entire electoral cycle during last year's gubernatorial and lieutenant gubernatorial and statewide constitutional races. We also have to remember that the DA herself was prohibited from filing any kind of investigation into Burt Jones, who is now the lieutenant governor. At that time, the DA Willis was a very well-known and vocal supporter of Burt Jones' opponent for the lieutenant governorship. That was Democrat Charlie Bailey. Robert McBurney, Fulton County Superior Court judge, said this is clearly and definitely a conflict of interest, and she was not allowed to pursue any further in-depth investigation into Burt Jones, who at that time was a state senator running for lieutenant governor.
And you know, we were talking about, I saw that Maria, our digital journalist here, she's off camera today. I know you guys know her because she often is anchoring Atlanta News First Plus. Maria had called up this graphic, which I think is going to just help our viewers just piece together the important players here. And we actually compiled this graphic of 16 officials who have testified, and you named some of them, Tim. But just so we can kind of, you know, I know that if you're not a political junkie, seeing the faces might help. So look at these high-profile individuals. Like you mentioned, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, former Georgia Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, Cobb County Elections Director Janine Evler, former White House National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, former U.S. House Speaker Newt Gingrich, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. You mentioned that he didn't really have any comments on this when he was asked about it today. Former DeKalb County Elections Director Erica Hamilton. And look, it's a very, very long list of high-profile individuals, and you know, perhaps one of the more noteworthy among them, not only the governor, Brian Kemp, but Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, because of that phone call that I think most of us have heard.
And let's talk also about Jeff Duncan. He was lieutenant governor during the investigation. He has been a very, very vocal critic of Donald Trump. In fact, he was under so much political pressure from within his own party, he did something virtually unheard of. It's unheard of for a lieutenant governor in Georgia to decide not to run for re-election after only one term. This was widely seen as an office that can be a stepping stone to launching a gubernatorial, congressional, or senatorial campaign. It's happened many times before with varying success. Jeff Duncan is basically out of the political or electoral picture right now, having taken what I can only imagine is a pretty lucrative, high-profile job as a CNN commentator. He also wrote a book about how his party needs to move on from the legacy of Donald Trump and move forward. So you can only imagine that he did not have very complimentary things to say during the grand jury hearing. Let's talk about Newt Gingrich, a man who was a Metro Atlanta congressman, one of a minority of Republicans for many, many years, and yet is the author of the Contract with America that allowed him to, and his party, to make historic, massive gains in the 1994 midterm elections that actually propelled the U.S. House to Republican control for the first time in more than 40 years. And Newt Gingrich here in Atlanta, that's where he made his reputation and really gained his national platform.
Yeah, and you know, looking at the list of these high-profile officials who were questioned, who testified, like I said, what I thought, you know, was one of the more noteworthy among them was Brad Raffensperger, Georgia's Secretary of State. And for those who haven't had a chance to hear the phone call between him and former President Trump in January of 2021, shortly after the 2020 presidential elections here in Georgia, this is what many observers, many individuals consider a very damning phone call and really gives rise to possible indictments. Let's go ahead and listen.
There's nothing wrong with saying that, you know, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes. You should want to have an accurate election. And you're a Republican.
We believe that we do have an accurate election.
No, no, you don't. No, you don't. You don't have. Not even close. There's nothing wrong with saying that, you know, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you...
Now, do you think it's possible that they shredded ballots in Fulton County? Because that's what the rumor is. And also that Dominion took out machines. That Dominion is really moving fast to get rid of their machinery. Do you know anything about that? Because that's illegal.
This is Ryan, Germany. No, Dominion has not moved any machinery out of Fulton County.
Under law, you're not allowed to give faulty election results, okay? You're not allowed to do that, and that's what you've done. This is a faulty election result.
Mr. President, you have people that submit information, and we have our people that submit information, and then it comes before the court, and the court then has to make a determination. We have to stand by our numbers. We believe our numbers are right.
Okay, wow. So that's the phone call. That is the phone call that, you know, many people say is kind of the key here. So bringing back in once again to join us, Tim Darnell, digital journalist here at Atlanta News First Plus, and I would consider you a political expert. You lead our political update every week. What's the significance of that phone call, particularly for Raffensperger?
Joy, that phone call has got to be considered the centerpiece, the focal point of DA Fani Willis's entire investigation into any alleged election interference from then President Trump back in January 2021. We have the entire transcript written on AtlantaNewsFirst.com in our political section. And, you know, we were going through it yesterday and reposting it, and I was looking at some of the content. That, what we're playing for our viewers and listeners right now, is only a few seconds of a phone call that lasted almost an hour on January 2nd, 2021. It's got to be considered the focal point. There are much more controversial and a lot of behind the scenes maneuverings that are indicated in this leaked phone call, and we have the entire transcript on AtlantaNewsFirst.com. Let's talk about also, we know President Trump was seemingly or allegedly attempting to affect the outcome of the Georgia presidential election, and Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State, was a central part of that conversation.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I apologize for the gesturing while you're talking, because digital journalist Maria Murrow is kind of off to the side, and we're kind of coordinating what do we have next coming up in the lineup. But you know, you touched on the timeline a little bit, and I know that Maria has prepared a graphic kind of laying out the timeline of the important events here from the election to kind of how we got to where we are right now, including that phone call. And of course, it all starts on Election Day, right? Of course, November 3rd, 2020, it was a Tuesday. This was the presidential election day, okay? A couple weeks later, November 19th, it's on a Thursday, 2020, the state of Georgia calls for Joe Biden. We all know that. Then Saturday, January 2nd, 2021, this is when that phone call happened, the one that we've been talking about, the one that we have been playing here at Atlanta News First, Atlanta News First Plus, where now former President Trump calls Raffensperger, asks him to fine 11,780 votes. Then also in January, I should say a year later, in January of 2022, that is when Fulton County DA Fani Willis petitions. She wants a special grand jury to look into this. And then May 2nd of last year, 2022, that's when this special grand jury is sworn in, and they start investigating. They went on investigating for some 8 months. They interviewed more than 70 witnesses, gathering evidence surrounding these potential crimes. And then finally, December of 2022, not too long ago, this special grand jury submits their final report to DA Willis. And then just a couple weeks ago, actually that should be last week, February 7th, DA Willis actually says a decision on charges is, quote, imminent. And then earlier this week on Valentine's Day, Fulton County Judge Robert McBurney ordered the partial release of this special grand jury report, and this is where we are today. This special grand jury report being released in part, largely kept under seal due to some constitutional rights issues that we have been discussing and breaking down with our experts. I want to bring in now investigative reporter Andy Parati, and of course, you've been digging into the filings, doing extensive research surrounding this case for months.
Hey, Joy, before we get into that, I want to bring in a special guest that has perspective that very few of us have, and that's former Senator Jen Jordan, former nominee for the Democratic Party for Attorney General, local attorney. But the reason why you're here today is to give us that perspective because you testified in front of the special grand jury. Before we get into that, before you take us behind the scenes, what's your takeaway from this 9-page report? Very little information. Things that we already speculated were going to be in there. But for you, what were some of the takeaways?
So one of the big takeaways is that there had to be a redacted report, which says to me, obviously, there are indictments coming. I think the second takeaway, I mean, the most significant, kind of bomb dropping was the fact that the grand jury believed that there were people who testified before them that committed perjury. And what's interesting about that is that this could actually touch people who weren't the subject, of the investigation, maybe weren't the targets of the investigation, but went in there and lied under oath, and they're going to get pulled into really what looks like it could be a pretty significant criminal conspiracy.
Take us to your time on the special grand jury as a witness. Tell me about the process and why you believe you were needed for this investigation.
So, you got to look at it from the perspective of this is about talking to witnesses, right? This is about people who were at a certain place at a certain time who can bring kind of firsthand testimony. Like I said, When we've talked before, this isn't my opinion or what I think. This is who did you see, who did you talk to, what did they say, that kind of stuff. And so they were really interested, obviously, in the hearing that took place in December at the state capitol.
2020.
Right, with Giuliani and Trump's legal team. The one that President Trump was live tweeting the whole time. And then they were really interested in the false electors meeting at the Capitol again. What I saw, who was involved, who was in the room, very interested in exactly who the players were.
It's important to remind our folks that are listening and watching on our streaming channel that not only were you in the room, but you were one of only 2 people pushing back against these false claims, and you were the subject of harassment and threats.
Yeah, there was a picture that was released because we will all remember this was back during COVID too. So me and another state senator, Elena Parent, we were wearing our masks, and all of a sudden there were pictures of us all over the internet purportedly counting ballots at State Farm illegally, and it was a picture of 2 blonde women in masks, and it ended up being a picture that had been on the cover of USA Today, right, out in Pennsylvania, but people didn't care about that. It really was about kind of having this narrative come out that something inappropriate happened in Georgia, and really that was not the case at all.
I want to touch on something that you just spoke about when you were in the room in front of these grand jurors. These weren't folks that were just sitting back and listening or watching a presentation. They were active. They were participating. They were asking you questions.
Well, and it's different from anybody else who's ever been on jury duty, right? Where you go in and you just listen to the presentation and then maybe you talk behind closed doors. I mean, this was an active group of, I think there were about 20 people in the room in terms of grand jurors when I was there. And for everything I said, there would be one question and then another. And really, it would just kind of pop around until, you know, we kind of came to the conclusion of whatever they were interested in.
I thought it was interesting that they noted they wanted it on the record that these weren't election experts or criminal attorneys or anything like that. Why do you think that they wanted that put on the record?
Well, because I think you know what your own limitations are, right? So when this report gets released in total at some point, people shouldn't be looking for some law review article. These are just regular folks, just like anybody else, who went in, heard evidence, and then have basically told you know, officials what their recommendations are. And they should be commended, because talk about undertaking a pretty serious task.
We talked about what was in the report, but there is a lot to be said about what was not in the report that can tell you what's to come. Let's talk a little bit about that. Specifically, they didn't identify what kind of criminal charges that they would want to bring in an indictment, nor did they say how many people. What else did you see that was not in this report that now you have lingering questions or you think might provide some answers down the road?
So I think what we're going to see down the road is very specific recommendations in terms of specific laws that they believe have been broken by people. I think we're going to see specific recommendations in terms of the targets, like who do they think broke these laws and why. One of the things that was incredibly interesting is that when we see these recommendations eventually, we're going to be able to see the breakdown of the grand jury vote.
The consensus, whether or not consensus.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, how many people voted yes, how many people voted no, how many people abstained. And what's also interesting is that the district attorney's office gave them the opportunity, the grand jurors, an opportunity to explain a vote if they wanted. So we're going to be seeing footnotes where maybe a grand juror says, you know, I voted no because of X, or I voted yes because of X, just to add more clarity in terms of their thought process. And like I said, we never see this in terms of the grand jury process because it's so secret. So this is just an incredibly it's really interesting as an attorney to be able to kind of pull back the curtain and see what really happened.
And one more thing, another thing that we both spoke about before we came back on is that they're acknowledging they may not know the exact specific charge that is appropriate, but they're leaving it up to the district attorney's discretion. Tell me why that might be important for them to reference in this report.
Well, I think it's important because this report is not like a box. It doesn't kind of, you know, the district attorney doesn't have to do exactly what, you know, they've said, or if they've said a specific statute, especially if in her discretion or her judgment, she thinks there's a better way to go. I mean, prosecutorial discretion is key here in terms of what what indictments she wants to bring and what indictments ultimately she thinks she can be successful on.
Jen, former state senator, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. The senator, one of 16 public officials who testified in front of this grand jury, 16 of the 75 witnesses total. Joy, we're going to send it back to you.
Thank you so much. Andy Parati, our investigative reporter, leading that interview and that coverage there. Thank you so much for that. We've talked about the very high-profile officials who have been part of this probe, even just as witnesses here. And one of the key witnesses is a U.S. Senator, Lindsey Graham. We've been talking about that. I want to share with you something brand new into our newsroom just a short time ago, where Senator Lindsey Graham was actually asked about this report. Again, this is all breaking. This report coming out just a short time ago. And then we had a crew actually ask Senator Graham his reaction to this report. Here's what he said.
We're expecting the Fulton grand jury parts of the report.
About it, I'll let you know when I know something.
All right. So, you hear there, didn't really have much to say about this report being released. It has been widely reported in media. It is well known that this report was going to come out today. But perhaps he, of course, it takes a bit of time to actually get a chance to read it. So that may be the reason for that reaction, and in fairness to him as well. But what are the legal ramifications here? Because ultimately, when you impanel a special purpose grand jury or any grand jury, that is because the prosecutor is hoping to ultimately, do an investigation and then, if necessary, issue indictments on any potential related to any potentially illegal activity. Now, this is a special purpose grand jury. It's not a regular grand jury. They didn't have the power to actually issue indictments in this case. Their job was basically just to make recommendations, and the prosecutor takes it from there. So that's what's happening. It's again, Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis impaneled this grand jury, or had this grand jury impaneled, basically saying, hey, look, you guys are going to look into this matter. Give me some advice. Tell me, after you interview all these witnesses and look at all this evidence, what do you think? Do I need to issue indictments here? And that's up to her to take it at this point, because the report has been out. The report actually came out in December, and today is the day when we actually got our hands on the report, parts of it, I should say. And I actually want to pull up for you part of the report, if I can do that. Kind of still learning this technology on the digital desk for Atlanta News First Plus. Okay, so here we go. Here's what I think is one of the most significant parts of this report. It says the grand jury heard extensive testimony on the subject of alleged election fraud from poll workers, investigators, technical experts, and state of Georgia employees and officials, as well as from persons still claiming that such fraud took place. And we find, by a unanimous vote, that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning that election. All right, so what does this mean? I want to bring in now an attorney, a criminal defense attorney no less, who can give us some insight and analysis. Holly Waltman joining us live here in our studios for Atlanta News First Plus. What does this mean?
Joy, I think this is an interesting conclusion, but I think something that's super noteworthy is that there were 24 special grand jury members that unanimously voted to come to this conclusion. That's twice a regular jury for a felony case. And so I think that is noteworthy because, of course, that is the conclusion that the DA's office was looking for and hoping for. I think more will be revealed about their recommendations on what charges might be coming down the pipeline. The other thing that I thought was really interesting as I was reading this on one of the breaks is that they also left room for the district attorney to use her discretion and bring additional charges that they may not have been recommending to begin with.
Right. And as we've been saying, it's really up to the district attorney, to Fani Willis, to make those calls, how she wants to proceed. But we are talking about the potential of criminal charges, and including for very high-profile individuals and politicians. What do you think we could see?
So I think we're going to see a lot of confusion, and we're going to see a lot of broken ways to get to the end result that they're hoping for. We have to also put this in context, right? Fani Willis and her office are in charge of prosecuting felonies that happen in Fulton County, Georgia. That is one of the busiest courtrooms in the state of Georgia that handles one of the highest volumes of cases, right? She also simultaneously finds herself in a multi-co-defendant gang case. So her office is working overtime, to say the least. I think that this is outside of her normal course of business and what she does in her office on a day-to-day status. And so I don't know that we can really, with a lot of certainty, predict the timeline or the way that she goes about this case, because it is so different.
Yeah, and she's been very tight-lipped about any potential indictments. Certainly hasn't said a word about who could potentially be indicted, but like you said, imminent. Her answer when we kind of tried to probe, when our newsroom kind of tried to probe into this and find out what's expected, was that a decision is imminent. I don't want to misquote her, but that's essentially the gist of it, that a decision would be imminent in the legal sense, not in the TV news sense, because we move fast on TV news. And the legal process moves slow because it's supposed to be thorough, of course. But we're talking about the potential for indictments. We're talking about the potential for criminal charges. What could these individuals involved, the targets of the investigation, potentially be charged with?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, imminent, her decision is imminent, and I think that she chose her words very carefully because her decision to present this to a regular grand jury could be made up already. What she chooses to present to them and what charges she puts in front of them is still left to be determined. One thing that is really noteworthy, I believe, here in Georgia to talk about and discuss is the crime of attempt, right? The crime of attempt can occur even if your plan wasn't successful, right? And so I certainly think that perjury is on the table. I certainly think that many crimes that otherwise could be charged in the alternative of attempting to commit a crime. So we will hopefully find out legally soon, not news soon, not news fast, what she plans to do.
And so we're talking about what I remember we used to call in law school, when you use all that legalese, the inchoate offenses. So like attempt, right? Or potentially even conspiracy, right?
Certainly, you know, when you get more than one person acting in a criminal way with a group of other people for a common goal, then of course conspiracy additionally on top of attempt, on top of an underlying offense, could be a possibility.
And maybe solicitation, right? I mean,
sure. I think there's a lot that's on the table that could be presented.
I've heard talk of potential RICO charges, according to some analysts. Why RICO charges, and what would that look like?
Yeah, so RICO charges are outlined in a different code section for Georgia law than typical felony offenses. And the racketeering and the conspiracy to do it in a group, right, is kind of, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound, right? We have something called parties to a crime. So if I make the plan and then you go along with me for the ride, guess what? It's almost as if you made the plan with me.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And if you're found, correct me if I'm wrong, in the state of Georgia, that if you're found guilty of conspiracy, you're found guilty of the underlying crime as well. So if you and I conspire that we're going to rob a bank, but only you go on the bank robbery and I don't, if you're convicted, if I'm convicted of conspiracy and you're convicted of bank robbery, I'm going to be convicted of bank robbery too, right? That's absolutely correct. So back in grade school when they said pick your friends wisely, that's exactly what they're talking about, and that is the way that Georgia law reads as well. Wow, that's incredible. I want to talk to you a little bit about this special purpose grand jury, because it is a rarely used, or basically a rarely used kind of body. It is different from a regular grand jury. How so? Yeah, so when Ms. Willis and her office decided that they needed to dedicate 24 Fulton County taxpayers and residents to look into this one matter, it's definitely different than a regular grand jury, which convenes on a regular basis during every term of court to decide if there is. And they're basically, a regular grand jury is just checking an officer or a judge's work to find if there is in fact probable cause to give the green light to the district attorney to move forward on prosecution. This special grand jury that she petitioned the judges to impanel for her
is different because, of course, they didn't have the authority to issue an indictment and to give her the green light to move forward in a normal course of prosecution. They rather investigated, asked their own questions, asked for additional supplemental documents, witnesses, so on and so forth, to make a recommendation to her that she could then present it to a regular grand jury to find if there is probable cause to move forward.
Yeah, you know, I also want to talk about the fact that we're just getting a very small tidbit of this report, and I shared with our viewers what to me seemed to be one of the most important sections of it. And just a reminder, if people are just joining us, this special report, this report from the Special Purpose Grand Jury and panel to look into the 2020 Georgia presidential election, see whether there was any illegal activity, perhaps by former President Trump or other individuals. You know, they released, I should say, they submitted this report in December after spending about 8 months doing their investigation, and then it was finally released in part today. But the judge had to decide, you know, was he going to release it? If so, how much of it was going to be released? And again, we've only got the introduction, we've got the conclusion, we've got Section 8, which is basically where these grand jurors talk about their concerns about witnesses lying to them under oath to the grand jury during the course of this investigation. Most of the report we're not getting. Most of the report the judge ruled we should not get, because if we did, it could violate the constitutional rights, specifically the due process rights of folks mentioned in that report. So I want to talk to you, Holly, a little bit about why that is and what due process rights we're talking about.
Certainly. So one of the things that I think Judge McBurney did an excellent job of doing is taking into account what the special grand jury asked for, right? Their recommendation was for this to become public. And because this is such a unique process in the legal system, I think that he recognized that these are Fulton County citizens, voters, and he is elected by Fulton County citizens and voters. And so he had to weigh he had to weigh against what Ms. Willis was asking him to do, which was to keep this private because it is an ongoing investigation. We want to preserve these individuals, if they are going to become defendants, right to remain silent, right to have an unbiased grand jury consider their case. We are thinking ahead to the very end in the law field when we have these sort of situations, because we're trying to make sure that if we use county money, taxpayer money, to prosecute individuals, we don't want to do it twice, right? We want to get it right the first time, and we want to get to a just answer that keeps everything fair for everyone involved.
So basically, DA Willis had to make sure that everything was by the book, that completely buttoned up, and that she really keeps her hands clean if down the road she wants a successful prosecution, a conviction, and if she wants it to hold and not potentially be overturned on appeal. Is that right?
Of course, that's right. And when you have something of this magnitude with this many high-powered individuals, there are going to be legal teams representing everyone that's involved in this. There are going to be multiple co-defendants that are in this indictment or indictments together. And so things become much more complicated when you're trying to preserve and protect and give every individual accused of a crime the protection that they're entitled under the Constitution of the United States and of Georgia.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you know, the constitutional rights should be safeguarded, and there was kind of a balance here. I want to bring in, though, at this point, our political reporter who has been following this extremely closely, because look, Holly and I have been talking about the legal ramifications here, but there are huge political ramifications. This could potentially change the landscape of American politics, especially right here in the state of Georgia. My colleague, political reporter Doug Reardon, is at Fulton County Superior Courthouse right now. Doug, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And keep in mind that we're less than 2 years out from a presidential election, and Donald Trump is one of two candidates to declare on the GOP side. I think people are very cautious on doing that. Taking on a name with as much prominence in the party as Donald Trump has is, of course, a very difficult task, a very scary undertaking for candidates who have never run a presidential election before. And so, you know, one of the experts that we talked to this week said this could really hobble Trump's ability to message to voters and and to keep, this positive message when you have a potential indictment against you for something as serious as trying to alter the results of election. And so, yes, absolutely, this could have implications on the national stage. It could also have implications on the state stage as well. We have a number of high-profile names on that list of fake electors who are all part of this probe, one being Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, the other being David Schaefer, who is the chair of the state GOP party, who very recently announced he would not be running for re-election to that position. And so, again, this is all speculation. We're going to have to wait and see what happens with this regular grand jury process and ultimately what District Attorney Willis decides to do down the road, the timeline for which we have no indication. One thing I want to mention that I think picks up from where you guys both left off is talking about the release of this report and how we got here. Of course, there was a fight to get even just these 8 pages released today, a fight that Atlanta News First was part of. District Attorney Willis didn't want this report released at all. Lock, stock, and barrel, she wanted it kept under wraps, again, in her words, to protect the due process rights of those who might be named in it. But of course, this is an extremely important document, crucial to voters, and something that had to do with the votes they cast in the 2020 election. And so we felt very important to have as much of this report as we could. And so Atlanta News First and a contingency of media agencies actually had to go to court to get this release. So this was somewhat of a compromise between those parties, District Attorney Willis and Judge Robert McBurney here in Fulton County. And again, there's no question that the most important, the most significant parts of this report certainly were not in what we got today in this relatively small filing. So a couple of things also, while we're talking about political implications, we also should note that Donald Trump did not testify before this special grand jury. He was one of only a few, if not the only to my knowledge, who did not come before and appear before this special grand jury in person to offer his testimony. And so super important to note, in my opinion. The next thing that we have to look forward to on this will come, we're told, on March 1st, which will be the next meeting of the regular grand jury, who, again, that is the body that will then recommend any charging decisions up to District Attorney Willis. That decision will be completely up to her, and for now, she is essentially the only one who has knowledge of any recommendations that have been made by the special grand jury up to this point. So perhaps not the explosive filing that we thought we might get today, but certainly some important information in there, including what you were both just talking about, that there were almost certainly several members who were called in to testify that perhaps committed perjury. That is no small deal, especially when we're talking about the names that we're talking about in this case. So again, timetable, we don't have one for you, but we'll certainly continue to follow this as this develops, both on air, on Atlanta News First Streaming Plus, and for now, we're live in downtown Atlanta, Atlanta News First. Doug Reardon.
All right, thank you so much, Doug. I apologize for the rough directing. I'm new to the Atlanta News First Plus desk, and where we actually, we get very involved and we actually operate some of the technology ourselves. So I apologize some of the bad technical directing. That's my fault. But excellent reporting by my colleague, political reporter Doug Reardon, joining us live from the Fulton County Superior Courthouse. So we're looking at this from all angles, right? We've been pulling in our investigative team into this. We obviously just heard from our political reporter. We're looking at some of the political ramifications of this. But this is really about potentially criminal charges here, right? So this is a big law case. That's why I want to bring in a criminal defense attorney who, of course, has been following this all very closely, thinking about just kind of how this process could work of potentially issuing indictments, what these charges could be. Sorry, we got a little photobomb, but this happens because we're live in the newsroom. Rachel Kaufman. Rachel, I know, we've discussed prosecutor, District Attorney Fani Willis, when she impaneled this special purpose grand jury, of course, the end game here is potentially to convict some people. What do you think?
Well, I think that they've spent months. This grand jury has spent months going through, I think, more than 75 witnesses, tons of digital evidence, and they've come to the conclusion that there has not been widespread tampering with an election that I guess could have affected it. There's still crimes that are involved with attempting to do those things, even if it doesn't result in an actual tampering with an election. I don't know what is taking so long. Just for example, like when Donald Trump is on the phone asking for 11,000 votes to individuals that do have the power to possibly do something about that, I'm not sure what takes a number of months and what kind of evidence it would really take to have a grand jury, not a special grand jury, but an actual grand jury, indict him. I think it would be quite simple. So I'm not sure what else needs to happen before she would go forward with charges. It seems as though there is enough evidence. However, based on the lack of widespread tampering, it doesn't appear that there's going to be like a RICO case or some larger criminal indictment with a number, like with several politicians.
Okay, well, I want to go back, though, if you don't mind, to the kind of phrasing here, and let's look at this document that was just released, this special purpose grand jury report that was just released. And I want you, Rachel, I want to borrow your legal mind. Let's look at how that last line was phrased. We find by unanimous vote that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning that election, I'm repeating it because I want to ask you, is that a big distinction there? Is it possible that there was widespread fraud, but yet it didn't have any impact?
Yes, and that would be like an attempt, basically a crime of attempt, like an attempt to commit an armed robbery, or there could have been if there is a substantial action in furtherance of it, even if it ends up not working out. Usually, in criminal law, you can still be charged with that crime. So I'm not really sure what that distinction means as it relates to that it wouldn't result in overturning the election. If tampering with an election happened by people who could have possibly had the effect of widespread fraud and creating, a system where our voting election rights don't have any integrity. I don't know what the distinction means. I know that the DA's office in the special grand jury release that they just had, that they gave them certain statutes and things to review as it relates to their charging recommendations. So I don't know if they've given them laws on party to a crime, on accomplice. So it's kind of unclear, and they did have a caveat in the report that basically said that by establishing that there had been no widespread fraud, that they're not saying that other crimes didn't occur. So I wish that there was more teeth to what we received, but it's a little bit vague.
Well, run me through though, what potential crimes could there be found here, or what potential indictments could there be?
Well, it looks like just from the individuals who were testifying at the grand jury, like there was some perjury that went on. That's a crime. Interfering with an election is a crime. Attempt to do those things is my understanding it's a crime. I don't know why it would be any different than attempting to commit a robbery and then just not being able to follow through. So it does seem that there can be charges, criminal charges that can come out of this, but that it doesn't seem that there's a pattern where there's this larger organization that's working together to overturn the election and actually do it.
Yeah.
But I don't know what took 6 months. In Fulton County, as someone who practices there regularly, they have a huge backlog. Our criminal courts have a huge backlog. I don't know if it's a staffing issue. Moving cases through the system takes way too long in Fulton County, and so the fact that they diverted resources to this just to come to this conclusion, and then kind of now we're just going to have to wait until Madam DA Willis decides whether or not she's going to go forward. I just wish that we could use our resources more efficiently.
And this jury spent about 8 months, conducting this investigation, interviewed more than 70 witnesses, gathered all kinds of evidence surrounding this 2020 presidential election. So, this was a special purpose grand jury, right? And I want to pick your brain a little bit about what does that mean? Because this is a body that's rarely impaneled, a special purpose grand jury. It's not like a regular grand jury. They don't issue indictments. How else is it different?
Well, it seems as though it's different in the sense that they're not being asked to true bill or no bill a case, meaning they're not asked to find whether there's probable cause to support formal charging. That's what a normal grand jury does. But the special grand jury, I've never seen it in my in my practice being used, but it is basically an opportunity for the state to have, Fulton County to have its constituents, individuals within the county, review the evidence to determine if it really makes sense to go forward. It appears as though there was a lot of evidence.
Sure.
That's a long time to be going through evidence. Usually a murder trial will take a week. So they went through months and months of interviews and documents to come to this decision where it appears that there's not widespread fraud. However, there's possible perjury and possible charges that they do recommend. And then whether or not DA Willis decides to go forward with them, that'll be for a different grand jury to decide.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. A lot more to discuss here. Criminal defense attorney Rachel Kaufman joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I know you're going to stick around. Hopefully you're going to stick around, for a little bit. We're going to take a quick break. Let you guys maybe take a quick break, but don't leave us, because we're going to bring you back into our special live team coverage of this special purpose grand jury report, which has just been released after they spent 8 months looking into possible criminal activity by the former president and several others surrounding the 2020 presidential election. So keep it right here on Atlanta News First Plus.
Atlanta. Life around here is something special. There's more of just about everything. More people, more places, and yeah, more traffic. But when you watch your local news, the first thing you see is more crime, more mugshots, more of the ugly sides of life. But Atlanta is so much more than that.
And that's why we're giving you more of what you actually want.
More coverage first from where you live. More weather experts to help you plan. The First Alert Weather Team has the most meteorologists in Atlanta, so we can always be there with you.
More accountability from us and those in power.
More solutions that put money back in your pocket.
And doing more live local events that show the good things happening here.
More hope that we can build a better Atlanta. We are the local news team that puts you first. We are Atlanta News First.
First Alert Radar is lit up.
2023 is off to a stormy start, but your First Alert weather team is keeping you prepared.
You want to get to your safe spot right now?
Helping you navigate flooded streets.
You need to be very careful.
Avoiding major road closures.
15 to 20 of these large cycle streets.
Our team keeping you informed around the clock with our First Alert weather app.
I got a notification on my app that says there's lightning in your area.
When we know, you know. This is why we First Alert.
All right, welcome back to Atlanta News First Plus. If you're just joining us, we are continuing our special live team coverage of the report just released. I actually have it in a pile of notes and papers, but this report released just a short time ago, and this is the special purpose grand jury's report. Remember, this special purpose grand jury was impaneled last year to investigate whether there was any illegal activity surrounding the 2020 presidential election here in the state of Georgia by former President Trump, along with several others. So just kind of, recapping where we are right now, they were impaneled last year, and the report now just released today. This is much anticipated. But I want to play for you a piece of what I would consider a piece of evidence that has really led us to the point where we are right now. And this was a phone call between former president, I should say, Trump and Brad Raffensperger, basically, talking about kind of finding votes. Let's listen.
You should want to have an accurate election, and you're a Republican.
We believe that we do have an accurate election.
No, you don't. No, you don't. You don't have. Not even close. There's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes. There's nothing wrong with saying that, now, do you think it's possible that they shredded ballots in Fulton County? Because that's what the rumor is. And also that Dominion took out machines. That Dominion is really moving fast to get rid of their machinery. Do you know anything about that? Because that's illegal.
This is Ryan Germany. No, Dominion has not moved any machinery out of Fulton County.
Under law, you're not allowed to give faulty election results, okay? You're not allowed to do that, and that's what you've done. This is a faulty election result.
Mr. President, you have people that submit information, and we have our people that submit information, and then it comes before the court, and the court then has to make a determination. We have to stand by our numbers. We believe our numbers are right.
All right, so that phone call, of course, between the former president and Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, and that really has been a focal point of this entire investigation, this special purpose grand jury probe into whether there was any illegal activity surrounding the 2020 presidential election in the state of Georgia. But I want to kind of I know there are a lot of pieces here and it's really confusing, so I just want to kind of show you a timeline so you have a kind of clear idea of how this whole thing unfolded, how we got to where we are right now. Of course, it all starts with the election back in 2020, November 3rd, which was a Tuesday, 2020, presidential election day. A couple weeks later, on a Thursday, November 19th, 2020, that's when the state of Georgia called for Joe Biden. And President Trump, of course, finds out he's lost. Fast forward to January of 2021, January 2nd, a Saturday. That is when that call just happened, where former President Trump calls Brad Raffensperger and asks him to find 11,780 votes. You heard the conversation. We played it for you just a moment ago. So January of 2022, a whole year after that, an entire year after that, that is when our own Fulton County District Attorney, Fani Willis, petitions for a special purpose grand jury to look into that phone call and a lot of other stuff surrounding the election and the actions of the former president and several others involving that election. So then a couple months later, May of last year, May 2nd, that special grand jury is actually sworn in and they start their investigation. They spend 8 months looking into this issue, trying to find out, was there illegal activity? Did the president, the former president, do something illegal? Other individuals, did they do something illegal regarding the 2020 presidential election? And so then at some point, of course, their investigation wraps up after they interviewed 70 witnesses, gathered a lot of evidence, and then they actually submit their final report last December, not too long ago. Last December, they submit their final report to DA Willis. And then just last week, February 7th, DA Willis announces that a decision on charges is imminent. And then this week, on Valentine's Day, February 14th, that's when we get the order from Fulton County Judge Robert McBurney announcing that that report, that special purpose grand jury report, will be released, at least in part, right? And again, this is the culmination of 8 months of work that this grand jury did to look into, whether there was illegal activity by former President Trump and many other people. So that's what we have today. This is this report that's now been released. But I want to explain to you that actually most of the details learned from this report we can't share with you. We don't even know what they are. A judge ordered that most of it has to remain under seal. And I want to share with you why. So I want to pull up just some of the language in that order from Judge McBurney. Sorry, I think we want to pull up the order from Judge McBurney. Sorry, little technical glitches there. Where Judge McBurney says, essentially, look, I'm not going to release the whole report. I'm not going to order the release of the whole report. I'm going to order the release of 3 sections. We're going to release the introduction, the conclusion, and Section 8, where these grand jurors talk about their concerns about people lying under oath during this investigation, lying to them. So here's what Judge McBurney said, quote, or wrote in his order: for anyone named in the special purpose grand jury's final report who is not afforded the opportunity to appear before the grand jury, none of those due process rights has been satisfied. And for those who did appear, willingly or not, only the right to be heard, although without counsel or rebuttal, was protected. Given that, the court finds that full disclosure of the final report at this time is not proper under Thompson, Kelly, and their progeny. Of course, he's citing several cases, for case law there, for legal precedent there. But essentially what he's saying is, we don't want to violate anybody's due process rights by jumping the gun and releasing this report in full, because this was not a trial. This wasn't a trial where people had the opportunity to have their defense counsel present, present their own defense case, present a rebuttal, cross-examine witnesses against them, present their own witnesses. They didn't get that opportunity. They didn't get that due process that's associated with the trial, because this was just a special purpose grand jury investigation. It was not a trial. And so let's not jump the gun and release people's names and, run the risk of convicting them in the court of public opinion. But I want to share something that's so interesting here, to me at least, which, I am a little nerdy. Fani Willis, of course, the Fulton County District Attorney, she didn't want any of this report released, none of it. She wanted the whole thing to stay under seal. Interesting, right? A lot of people wonder, why would she make that decision? Well, let's actually listen to her during the January 24th hearing, where she states her case.
In this case, the state understands the media's inquiry and the world's interest. But we have to be mindful of protecting future defendants' rights. And so, representing the state of Georgia and these citizens, I know we do have this common interest. We want to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. And we think for future defendants to be treated fairly, it's not appropriate at this time to have this report released.
Obviously, we believe the report should be released now.
Yeah, okay, so you heard Fani Willis, right, saying she doesn't want this released. She didn't want to violate the due process rights of any potential defendants, because actually that could ultimately backfire if she does successfully prosecute the case, get a conviction. If she doesn't follow the letter of the law, if she messes up in any way, it could lead to the whole thing being overturned on appeal. So you see, she was very careful. She said, let's not run the risk. Let's not release this report at all. And on the other side, what you heard, the guy talking at the end there, he's actually a lawyer representing the media, a media coalition that we at Atlanta News First were actually part of. And this media coalition, the attorneys for the media coalition sued because they wanted the whole thing released. Citing freedom of the press, First Amendment, judicial transparency, the right for the public to know everything about our judicial process as much as possible. But you see, the judge kind of ruled somewhere in the middle. On one side, you don't get to see any of it. On the other side, we want to see all of it. And the judge said, okay, we're going to see some of it. And here's what we saw. So let's go back to this. What did we see? Well, here's this report, just released, again, a short time ago. And to me, this was really the key part of this report that we got to see. The grand jury heard extensive testimony on the subject of alleged election fraud from poll workers, investigators, technical experts, and state of Georgia employees and officials, as well as from persons still claiming that such fraud took place. We find, by a unanimous vote, no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning that election. Let me say that again. We find by a unanimous vote that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election that could result in overturning that election. We've had several guest analysts joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus. It doesn't mean they didn't find any fraud, but nothing that would actually result in overturning the election. So now the question is, are there going to be charges? Is someone going to be indicted, right? Well, we don't know that. We, of course, as journalists, did our due diligence. We asked those questions. We asked Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis in her office, are there going to be indictments? When are they coming? And her answer was, decisions are imminent. So that's why we're going to keep a close watch of this case. And see when those decisions take place, see if there are any indictments, and if any of these high-profile officials and politicians who are named as targets of the investigation and as witnesses, are any of them going to be indicted? So we got a lot that we got to follow up on, and of course, that's the reason why you should stay with us right here on Atlanta News First Plus. Keep joining us, keep checking in here on our digital platforms, but also our regular television broadcasts on Atlanta News First, because we're going to follow all the breaking developments and bring you any updates as we receive them. Thank you so much for joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Joy Lib-Nakrin. It's a pleasure to join the team and get to join all of you.